Okay, today is Friday, February 10th. This is an interview by Marcia Fishman with Al Kehrer, conducted at Georgia State University at the Southern Labor Archives. And we can get started, I think. Make sure that my little needles are moving. Hang on, let me. Okay. Well, let's start with where and when you were born.
I was born in Brighton, on a farm outside of Brighton, Michigan, on January 11th, 1921.
How many siblings did you have?
I was the fifth of eight.
And what did your parents do?
My father, when I was born, he was a dairy farmer. My mother was a house. My mother was a mother. She had her hands full.
Was Brighton a farming community?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
And then how long did you stay there?
I was about 2 or 3 years old, I think.
Where did your family go to?
We moved to Detroit, and my father was involved in the auto industry.
Where did he work?
It was Briggs Body. At that time, automobiles were made, the bodies were made of wood, and that was he got into the wood making part of the whole business.
What year was that?
Must have been 23, 24, something like that.
Real early.
Yeah. And he ended up as a member of management, but went into the design department where they used wood to make the design and patterns, which then became the tool and die people made.
Right, I was going to say the dyes.
Made the metal parts. But he finished up in that department.
Did your mother work outside the home ever?
Yeah. My father was, well, he and I stopped talking to each other after a while because he was such a character. And he had a very roving eye. And so there was a period of time when she had to go to work, she became a beautician. And she may have had other jobs, but that was essentially it. And in order to support the family.
Were they native-born Americans?
Yes. But they were second generation. Matter of fact, my mother went to a German-speaking school as a child, and the whole thing changed with World War I, and what had been a pretty much cohesive German community began to split off and Americanize.
Sure. I know people changed their names.
Yeah. My family didn't. Her maiden name was Mueller.
Mm-hmm.
It became Miller. Other than that, but there were very important changes in terms of outside and behaving in relationship to the whole community. And, the best thing you could say about my father at that time was he was a Democrat and a big supporter of Al Smith, who ran for the presidency. I remember as a little one distributing Al Smith's literature up and down the street, that kind of thing.
Where did his Democratic predilections come from, you think?
I'm not sure. Of course, the various, whether it was Polish or German, it was always substantially, well, probably more than anything else, the family was Catholic. And that obviously had an impact on the politics, both at the local and up to the national. And as a matter of fact, my first school was a parochial school.
Which one was that?
Precise name Assumption grew out home on Gratiot Avenue.
So many of them are gone now, I know.
Really?
Archdiocese closed a lot of the Catholic schools in Detroit, unfortunately.
It was there the last time I went through. I don't think very much of Detroit.
You were raised on the east side.
Yes. And so I have not been there very much.
Well, you were there during the Depression, too, and it must have
Oh,
been...
yeah, right, that, and, you know, but I left Detroit as fast as I could get out of there. It was, I took my wife back there to show her where I grew up. And, that's been about 10, 15 years ago, I guess. The church and the school were still there. But they should have been closed a long time ago.
As you were getting to your teen years in high school, what did you expect to do next at that point?
Oh,
Was that before World War II, or?
It was before World War II, yeah. I simply went to school, you know, and I did. Well, what I ended up with was being substantially influenced by several teachers at Denby, and it was from that I got interested in the labor movement.
Really?
Yeah.
How did they interest you?
Well, one was Florence Sweeney, who's now dead. She was the first president of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, and she took me under her wing, would invite me over for dinner and evening discussion groups and that kind of thing, and talk about politics and the unions and all that kind of thing. The other one was a man by the name of Max Jaslov. Max Jaslov was also an English teacher. He was much more radical, let's say, than she was. He used to teach workers classes at night for the UAW. That's how I got bound to the UAW. But he was a very nifty guy. He didn't like the school library, so he had his own library in the classroom, and you got extra credits for reading the books in his library. And his books were not terribly different from others, but there's always some little influence there. And you also got extra credit if you went to the night classes. And you also got extra credit if there was in Detroit at that time, a very, very, very good lecture series at Central Methodist Church in downtown. And if you went to those, you got extra credit. So he had lots of incentives for his students.
Right.
And when you got to the UAW hall and sat in on the classes, we teach things like public speaking and parliamentary law and all the basic stuff. And if you were there in the hall and there's a picket line going on, next thing you knew, you had leaflets in your hand and you were out on the picket line. You know, it flowed very easily, very naturally, and of course, Detroit at that time was a very exciting place. And, if you weren't on strike, you were nobody. You know, it was just and going back to the family, that's when my father was in a member of management, and we used to come home boasting about how we crossed the picket line.
Wow.
And that hurt very badly, and we had many very knock-down, drag-out kinds of arguments about what he was doing.
Was your mother more supportive of your activities?
Yeah, I guess. She was never very political or very much involved. She had, with 8 kids, she had her, and they all were inevitably there were all kinds of problems. But as far as one thing, well, she used to supervise more or less the work that you did. We all had a very strong push to help support the family, especially during the depths of the Depression. At one point, my father was laid off, and he sold butter and eggs door to door to keep things going. We had our own house. That was what he had built the house. So from that standpoint, we had, we didn't have that kind of pressure. But
And they managed to stay off of welfare or general assistance also?
yeah, well, of course, at that time there wasn't what we have today. I recall my oldest brother worked for the WPA at one point, or whatever it was called at that time, but it was pick and shovel kind of work.
Right.
But my brothers and sisters were pretty resourceful. I mean, I started out, my first paid work was as a shoe shine boy.
Where at?
Right down the street. I was not very good.
How could you be not good as a shoe shine boy? What would that involve?
Well, you have to really be able to shine shoes. And I didn't do very well. And, but then there was an opportunity to buy a little paper route. So that was my next $3 bicycle, which didn't run half the time. And that was tough because, that was the kind of role my mother played. She would make sure I got up at 3:30 in the morning, and it was not bad in spring and summertime, but in the depths of winter, it was pretty rough. And so, but she finally persuaded me that was I had to move on to something because now I'm talking about I was 11, 12. If I added it all up, I would just about break even at the end. But we had nasty customers who would insist on paying you by the month, and then by the time you got around to collecting, the month they had moved. So you were always struggling to just keep things going.
Let me make sure this is picking up. Okay. You mentioned Central Methodist too. Just going back to that, what lectures were those or talks?
He had a minister's name was Henry Crane, fabulous preacher, and he had a Wednesday night public lecture series in which he had all kinds of Norman Thomas came and Carl Sandburg came, and he had all the very big names for that period of time. And it was just a general kind of forum thing. Very, I remember it was very inspirational and very. The League of Industrial Democracy, which is still around, had a road team that went out and spoke everywhere. And they routinely were signed on to Central. Big crowds. And we always sat, a big group of students sat in the balcony and listened to all this,
And what did you do as after you finished high school?
Oh, well, I haven't gotten
Or I skip.
through
I
that.
don't really want to skip. We'll be back up.
Yeah. During that period of time, well, we haven't finished my work.
Sure. Oh, that's right. You're losing money on a paper route when we last left.
I then I began to work for an ice house. I don't know whether you know what an ice house is.
Sure, because they had to deliver ice.
Well,
before
and they
refrigeration
sold ice to people that came and drove up in their car. And you put the 50-pound block on the rear bumper and they took it home. Yeah, I worked there for a man who was it's after a while you get to know how mean and how cheap they are. I've worked half days, mostly when school was out, but always even when school was on. I worked half days for 25 cents, and Saturdays from 8 until about 10 for 50 cents. And the interesting thing about that was the 50 cents was hard work, and I was just a skinny little kid. But the half days, if I didn't work the full half day, he would deduct the hours that I didn't work. So I would end up like, instead of 25 cents, I would end up with 13 cents. and
How old were you?
I was about 13, I guess. But it was, but I think the important thing is my mother always encouraged us to be involved that way. And I mean, whatever we could bring in it was close by. Didn't have to worry about where I was. Yeah, I used to tell students and workers afterwards, well, yeah, you're exploited. You're getting 75 cents an hour. 13 cents for 4 or 5 hours is hardly the living wage.
Oh. And all the money went to the family then? Is that the way you did it?
Well, I kept back some always because I have to have some money to go to the movies, but most of it went to the family.
You probably took trolleys, right? Places? Or did your family have a
Oh,
car?
yeah, well, Detroit at that time had streetcars. And the streetcars were expensive. They were a nickel.
That could eat up your wages pretty quickly.
Exactly. I didn't go downtown very often. Yeah, that was, you walked. I mean, I walked to school and walked for most places I wanted to go. But if you wanted to go downtown, it cost you 10 cents round trip. And that was...
Did your brothers and sisters work
Oh,
similar
yeah,
kinds
all,
of jobs
all
too?
various kinds of things. They were just, they just, you name it, they did it at one time or another. They just, as a matter of fact, when we have family reunions now and laugh about the kinds of things that we did, Anyhow, that was important in terms of the whole work and school experience.
Sure.
And during that period of time, I left the church and then being involved in all these groups, then being involved in the labor movement, it radicalized me.
That must have been hard with your family leaving the church.
Yeah, that
Popular.
was a very difficult time. My mother had great problems with that because sending all us kids to parochial school was, they had to pay. I mean, it wasn't a lot, but it was not cheap. So that was involved in the whole thing too. I saw the church as a very bad influence on working people.
How was it, so you think?
Well, we had the pastor of the church was Father Joseph Marks, and he was a mean son of a bitch. I mean, he was, and he would stand up in church on Sunday and preach about the people who were going to go to hell because they put pennies in the offering box, in the offering basket, and that was bad enough that he was threatening them in terms of fundamental kinds of, you're going to hell, kinds of things. But also he would go on to say, and it is very difficult for the ushers to count. and he was, and you know, you went to confession regularly. I was an altar boy for a couple of years. Went to confession regularly, and I used to time it so I would avoid his being in the confessional because he was such a mean bastard. And he just, I mean, you know, what kinds of sins the small kid had, and he would rant and rave and threaten, and, you know, it, scare the hell out of you, you know.
And now in the 30s too, I think, is when you had Father Coughlin.
Oh yeah, he was a very big influence in Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, he had a big influence on my father.
Did he?
Yeah.
I was going to ask what your family thought of him.
Oh yeah, no, he was, and that was also part of my separation from my father. My father became involved in a crazy outfit called Direct Credits. There were a number of crazies wandering around with solutions to everything. And this guy was, what was his name? It'll come to me. But anyway, he organized big groups, but they were all kind of paramilitary with uniforms and bands, and they didn't carry guns, but they had all the other trappings, you know. And my father became a general in that outfit. Looking back on it, it was very sad, very pathetic. But you know, we were put into marching groups, and they had parades.
Was its basis political or community or religious?
Yeah.
Or?
Well, they didn't vote particularly, but this guy wrote lots of little pamphlets, and he had some strange ideas about taxation and property, and I guess, you know, looking over the history of America, he was not out of place. I mean,
right.
There have been lots of them. And, but my father was very much involved, and I guess all the rest of his life he was involved in.
And then Father Coughlin, did they listen to him at all?
Yeah, yeah.
He was on the radio.
He was
locally
radio,
and nationally.
yeah. Oh, yeah, right. And, but, you know, that was also part of the whole, it was, I guess, I'm not sure whether or not Direct Credits was a subsidiary or was it, but it's very closely aligned to the whole kind of fascist thinking. And that was all going on at the same period of time. And the more my father got into that, the more I was going in the other direction. And then we developed a group of young radicals, some of whom were students of Max Jazzos, some of them were from outside, other places. And later on, during my high school, we used to meet regularly. On Sunday afternoon, we'd go out in the park and have discussion groups. And it was co-ed, but not any sexual. It was just all big intellects,
okay.
You know, big talk. And, so that went on for this entire period of time. And it was kind of unique. Not only was it all labor-oriented, several of them went on and became officers of their local union. They were in the auto workers. But we were also integrationists.
I was going to say, I was wondering if it was interracial.
Yeah, it was a big point to work on this. And, you know, we would do crazy things like going down into the center of Detroit and going to black nightclubs, you know, for great music. You know?
I'll bet.
You know, that kind of thing. And then we involved, as several that went on after high school, went to Wayne State. It was called then. What was it called?
Before it was Wayne State?
Anyway,
I don't remember what the name was.
Wayne something, Wayne College or something. It was not. I don't think it was even a university. But in any event, we would invite blacks to come to our little discussion groups, which I did, and we worked on this. Then most of us became young socialists. The Young Socialist League was very big at that time, and got involved in that. The meeting kind of way, and marching and pickets, and that whole kind of thing.
Was that still high school years or after?
Both,
Yeah.
both, yeah.
That must have been, well, was it frightening, especially the interracial aspect? I know my mother tells me a story of one of her first political activities, and I forget what it was even now, Progressive Party maybe, something, but being accompanied back to the bus stop by two African-American men she had met there, and being hooted at and called names just on the street, especially being a woman, was even more controversial.
Yeah.
Did that feel safe? Or?
Oh, yeah, I don't think that was ever any kind of real concern. I guess it's because I personally have never really felt physical fear about anything, whether it was since that, whatever it was. And it's still a little bit of difficulty in the family, because I'm very casual about well, that happened, It's never feeling any kind of worry or fear about that aspect of the community now.
In those early years in Detroit, what were the messages in your home about race and integration?
Largely silent, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not something that was talked about. And then during that period of time, and that's probably because of Florence Sweeney and Max Jaslow, I began to read. I was, while the rest of the family were out playing baseball or doing something else, I would get my 4 books at a time from the library and read, and they had an influence on the kinds of things I would read. So,
Sure.
where you could get a hold of them, whether they would take them from their libraries. But yeah, my brothers and sisters still talk about. Yeah, all you had was your book. Your nose buried in it,
Did you take it everywhere?
I would find a hideout somewhere, wherever it was quiet. That also was going on at the same period of time. And I did very well in those, wherever Max Jaslow, I tried to get him to teacher all the time, because it was a pleasure, I get all A's from him, because all my extracurricular activities were such that, but I had a difficult time other than that. 2 or 3 things. I had one English teacher who she was quite conservative and would make us read stupid stuff, And the worst class I ever had was typing. We had mandatory typing in order to graduate. You had to take a typing class, and I couldn't ever read. I couldn't reach 15 words a minute, because they had these stupid form letters from the business community, in which they would be. The writer of the letter would be describing these terrible workers. And I get so angry that I couldn't pass the. I was so frustrated, having to type this stupid stuff. And so that was a tough time, and you had to have it in order to graduate.
Wow. Boys and girls, so it wasn't just to train girls to be secretaries.
I was in college prep.
Were you?
Yeah. So I remember this. My counselor was, considering everything, I guess he wasn't so bad. And he had to deal with people like me. And this typing teacher would, and I would, I'd pitch a fit and slam the book on the floor and say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do and she would complain to him. And, he'd counsel me, you have no options here. You have to pass that 50 words a minute. And she finally came to me and said, he's failing. He ain't going to pass it. So he persuaded her, look, pass him, give him a D, so he can get through this thing. And they negotiated it. Finally, she said to him, look, I'll give him a D, but he's got to repeat the class. But he can't repeat it in my class. I won't have him in my class. He can go to another of those teachers. I finally limped through that thing. But it was, so it was not all easy. Well then, before I graduated,
So you were saying they spent 2 days looking for the captain, had gone overboard, never found him?
no, it was ridiculous, and so we then took off again for Tokyo, and we finally made it. But communications in those days were not like they are today. Well, they're probably about the same, but we got to the harbor there on the way into we're going to end up in Yokohama. And the Navy came alongside and said, who are you? And my captain, they just hand megaphone, show him who it was. That's not true. You're not him, because we have a message here that you were washed overboard. back, the date way back. We said, oh, well, powerful, of course. Of course, messages have been going back and forth all over the Pacific, trying to describe our condition. But anyway, we spent November to April in dry dock in Yokohama. Now, this is right after the war.
That's right. It's 2 months or so after surrender.
Yeah. And it was a horrible but fascinating kind of place, because so much of Tokyo had been firebombed. It was just, but I was very lucky. When I was in school at college, we had an exchange program with Japan, and one of the exchange students was a young woman by the name of Kyoko Takeda, and Kyo was interned when the war broke out, and finally ended up teaching Japanese to American flyers at Yale. And then she was exchanged for an American diplomat. She was, turned out, I didn't know this, but she was in school, but she was a member of a very high-ranking Japanese family, and a Japanese Christian, by the way. And I remembered when I was in Tokyo that the Japanese philosopher Hayakawa was her mentor. And I said, well, I'm going to see what happened here. So I searched up Hayakawa, and he said, oh yes, she's still around. She works for the YWCA here. So I met her again, and that was really quite an experience, because then ultimately she took me around Japan. We took a train. As the purser pharmacist mate, I wrote all kinds of orders, in the captain's side. One of the orders I wrote was directing the military to give we were in a kind of no man's land as far as military was concerned. We were under military rules, but we weren't military.
Right. Merchant Marine, especially during the war, was
Yeah,
an odd.
and well, military, most of the people didn't like this particular. I would write these fancy orders, one of which was that Lieutenant E.T. Kehrer was to be given every courtesy on his trip to Kobe, Japan. And he will be accompanied by Miss Kyoko Takeda, his interpreter. Well, that caused a lot of eyebrows being raised, but I was successful in getting it done. She took me down to her family home, which is near, well, she had gone to Kobe College, which is near where the earthquake was just been, and took me to her family home, and it was a fascinating experience because her brother, who was then the head of the family, took us to Nara and to Kyoto and all these places, and it was very exciting. And of course, I was able to get an insight into what was going on, you know. So that we would do trips just. Every time I wanted to go somewhere, I'd write another order. So we left. The Japanese finally got our ship working, and we left for home. Stopped off in Hawaii to get fresh fruits and vegetables, and we were supposed to go first into the West Coast, and then they changed our orders to go into Mobile, and so we had to go through the Panama Canal. We had the distinction of being the only ship to completely block the Panama Canal during the war.
How did you manage that?
We broke down, and the current carried us sideways, and we got jammed into the canal. And so by this time, the Navy was calling us Japan's secret weapon, you know, because you know, they would make these elaborate rendezvous plans for us, you know, like rendezvous at Ulysses, or rendezvous at Eniwetok, or somewhere. And they'd wait for us, and they'd give us up finally because we were either broken down or stumbling along, and it was a funny ship. It's a long story, but let me tell you what happened. We finally got into Mobile, broken down. They pulled us by tug all the way. But tugboats, you know, most ships, if you notice them, have two tugboats because a ship that's being steered by a tugboat.
Right. You have to have them out at an angle in front, two of them,
right,
to do it right.
Right.
Yeah, I have
We
a
had
sort of
one.
gut feeling that would work right. I don't know why the physics is that way, but
well, because otherwise you go one direction, and then you keep going while the tugboat's going the other direction. I spent that entire part of the trip filling out insurance papers because we were knocking down all the buoys as we went, but we only had one tugboat. We got up, I'm leaving out a lot of the interesting stuff, but we got up to, by the way, my captain, by the time, he started out black-headed, he was absolutely white when we got there, because it was, you know, and it was pretty hard on him. He was also a character, but he didn't do well. So we broke down all these buoys on the way up the Mobile Channel, and then they had a pilot who took the ship over and so we got up. And at this point we had no power, and they were shouting through the megaphones. And the understanding was that when we got within 20 feet of the dock in Mobile, his first mate was to drop the anchor. He had to do it manually. Didn't have any power. And while the pilot was doing that with the first mate, he also asked the people on shore, how much water are we drawing here? And the tugboats were also pushing, the tug was pushing on us toward the dock. And the agent on the shore said 18 feet. Well, we were drawing about 24 feet. So we ended up about a good stone's throw from the dock, stuck out in the water, in the mud.
On the ground.
The crew left. They
were fed up.
They were completely fed up. Within 15 minutes, there were 3 people left on the boat, of the ship: the captain, myself, and the first mate, who had been stuck down at the bow. The crew abandoned ship. That was a big scandal too, because they tried to make charges against the crew, and all this kind of stuff. Well, in those days, I went on to Yale finally.
Eventually, right?
Yeah. In those days, the New York Times, the back page of the New York Times was a shipping news page. Fascinating. If you know anything about the sea, you can tell which ship was going where, and what it was carrying, and how many passengers it had. Anyway, I used to read it regularly. First thing, there's a story that the Navy has commissioned. That ship went into mothballs up in Mobile. The Navy recommissioned her. It was now then the USS Mission San Miguel. That was the name of the ship. And that winter, New York had a tugboat strike. Harry Truman finally ordered the Navy to bring in oil for emergency for hospitals and that kind of thing. Front page of the New York Times. Navy mission ship breaks down at sea. I said, exactly, I know what ship that is. There could only be one to break down at such a time. It was true. The Mission San Miguel broke down at sea, and they had to tow it into port.
And who ended up towing it then? If they're on strike, they got somebody.
Oh, the Navy did their own dirty work. The following spring, there's a story on the shipping page. Navy vessel goes aground in Eniwetok Atoll. I said, of course. I know what ship that is. That's the Mission San Miguel. It was. It is still on the beach in Eniwetok.
Really?
And I live long enough. I'm going to go.
That's where you should go visit, right?
I'm going to go visit because I'm going to walk up to that ship there, resting on the beach, and kick it. Kick that.
That deserves at least that.
Anyway,
That's amazing.
Yeah, that was quite a story.
I know. They could make a movie of that. It's great.
Yeah.
I can see it. Like a wacky ship in the army type movie.
Yeah, right. It was wacky, all right.
Then you mentioned you did some college before the merchant
Oh, yeah.
Marines? A bit?
Yeah. I did 3 years.
Oh, so all right. So you almost
Yeah.
finished. That was at Olivet?
Yeah,
What were you studying there?
political science.
Did you think you were going to teach or what?
I guess the more I got into it, the less. Well, it was the certificate that was really a big drag. The guy who taught the education stuff there was terrible, and it was very discouraging. But I did very well. My undergraduate work was pretty good, I must say.
And then when you came out, you went back to Olivet to finish up?
I finished up in 46, graduated in 47.
And then, so in 47 then you went straight to Yale?
Yeah.
Just about? How did you pick there?
Well, I saved a little money from the Merchant Marine. when you're in the Pacific, you were on triple pay, war zone pay. So, you didn't, unless you gambled, there was no place to spend the money, so I put it all in the bank. I actually had a fellowship to the University of Sweden at Gothenburg. And then got to thinking about it and said, if I'm going to go to graduate school, I really ought to go someplace with a name, that's got some prestige and maybe somebody will pay attention.
Looks good on a resume.
Yes, exactly. Yale at that time had a one-year crash master's degree. But I just had about enough money for that. That's why I went to Yale. My academic work was very good. So I went.
And then after it went, because when you left Yale in '48, at some point you became a field rep for the
Yeah.
AFL Workers'
Well, after I got
Education
my
Bureau.
degree
Okay.
in June of 48.
48. How did you decide to do that?
I was just job hunting. I was interested in workers' education. And Florence Sweeney was very helpful. She knew a lot of people. She was a vice president of the National Teachers Union, AFT. And a fellow by the name of Arthur Elder cropped up. He was a big wheel in the AFT. He was still at that time director of the Labor Studies program at the University of Michigan. I guess it was at Michigan State, but there was the whole state. And I talked to these people and said, be on the lookout for. I'm eager to get started. And this job came open. John Connors, who was the director of the Workers' Education Bureau. Workers' Education Bureau, by the way, was the so-called educational arm of the old AFL. They didn't have an education department. This was kind of, the AFL was in Washington, the Workers' Education Bureau was in New York, but and the AFL contributed some money. John Connors had been an organizer at one point for the AFT. So when they called him and said, "Hey, we got a hotshot young prospect," I was. It was difficult to break into anything, and so I was willing to do practically anything. I got paid $65 a week. It's a magic number somehow.
Right.
And living in New York, even in those days, that was not easy. But it was an interesting experience. I got to travel a lot. Now, my special task was to develop programs with various levels of unions on what we then called human relations. It was to get people to deal with the whole question of race, very elementary, As a matter of fact, one of the terrible things we used to do is to put on little conferences, discussion groups and whatnot, using the little movie that Frank Sinatra made called The House We Live In.
Oh, right.
We use that as the basis to start the discussion. Okay, what is this house we live in?
Be great.
Okay.
So what unions were you working with?
Well, largely with central bodies and state federations. some unions. I worked with the laborers, I worked with the teachers. There were 6 or 8 or 10 different unions that were making some pass at putting an education program together. Yeah. It was not a very successful program. Well, we did some interesting work.
What kind of attitudes did you come up against? Trying to
Mostly,
work
what
on
are you
that?
talking about? What kind of a problem are you raising with us? You know, we don't have any such really difficulty. You know, now that union over there might, or this state fed over there down the road might.
So the leadership that you were dealing with was probably almost all white.
Yeah, and almost totally male. Yeah, and, but we did some interesting, without thinking, we did some important things. One of the things we did was John Connors was named U.S. representative to UNESCO in Beirut at the very time of the AFL convention, which took place in Cincinnati. I helped run the education committee of the convention, which routinely they write all this stuff and nobody pays attention to it. So we put in a resolution to the full convention that the AFL contributes $35,000 a year to the Workers' Education Bureau. Now, that Education Committee report was the last item on the agenda before the convention was closing. And I guess it was read. I don't remember it being read, but it was approved. And when Connors got back, we said, "Wow, what great things we have done, man! We got $35,000 from the AFL, from George Meany, who was then the Secretary Treasurer." And a month went by, 2 months went by, 3 months went by, and no money. So Connors, I think he wrote to me saying, convention minutes reflected the AFL was supposed to give us $35,000. Well, I didn't know this. The committee obviously didn't know it. The committee is made up of all delegates from various unions to the convention. The rule in the AFL was you could pass resolutions like, we think that you ought to contribute more money to and the incoming executive council should do so. You'd never recommend in a convention resolution a specific amount of money. Well, Meany he apparently went through the roof. How dare they do something like this? The upshot of that was that he said, well, if we're going to get into that kind of money, we're going to have more to say about what goes on. And that was after I left, after I went to the LG. They moved the office down to the AFL building, and it became the Department of Education.
You could keep an eye on it.
Exactly. Absolutely, exactly. Because when it was in New York, you never paid attention to it, It was just something off there in the other world. So, without our even having any revolt idea. By the way, it was an excellent idea that it happened that way, because otherwise, nothing would have. We were always the fifth wheel out there somewhere.
Then testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know if it'll pick up this far, but testing. Now we finally are ready to resume the interview with Al Kehrer on Friday, February 17th at Georgia State. We had talked about wanting to back up a little bit and for sure talk about your experiences at Olivet College. When did you go there?
It was in 39, 41. And thing I wanted to get on the record was that Olivet in those days was a very special place. It was headed by a man by the name of Joseph Brewer, who had been a Rhodes Scholar and worked and studied at Oxford University a great deal. And he transferred to Olivet the Oxford system of tutorials. We had our class size was no more than 7 persons in each class, and you had your own tutor. Small college, of course, was only 350 people, and it was a very exciting place in terms of learning to do research and independent study. No large classes, no large lectures, rooms, and a very unique kind of approach to education, which has been over the years picked up by a number of colleges and universities as a way to do business.
What made you decide to go to Olivet?
Well, I had a couple of friends who, from this group I talked about earlier, who ended up there, and they were very high on it. My alternative at that time was to go to the University of Michigan, which then had roughly 20,000 students, and the contrast seemed to be too much for me. Also, at Olivet, I was able to negotiate a rather big scholarship in a work system so that I could afford to go there. I started in Olivet with about $125 to my name, and so that was a key part of the whole thing. But it was a great faculty, very, very badly underpaid. My tutor, who left there and became president of a college in Maine, finally, before he retired, was earning $3,600 a year, and then not getting paid half of the time. So about all he had was the love of teaching and a house to live in. So it was. I just wanted to get that point into the record.
What did you study while you were there?
I was in political science.
And did you worked while you were attending Olivet?
Oh yeah, in those days you had student work programs, and I worked the maximum number of hours.
Did you still do some work with the UAW at that time, or?
I was really kind of on the side connected with what was going on. As a matter of fact, one of the people from the UAW became a professor of economics at Olivet. It was Tucker Smith. In the great photographs of the goons beating up the Ruthers, and
right.
Well, Tucker Smith was the one that took most of the brunt of it.
That was at the Battle of the Overpass? That one?
It may have been that one, yes. So that, and he, of course, still had his hand in the labor movement and encouraged my interest and would take me to NLRB meeting hearings and that kind of thing. So
well, in fact, in somewhere in the background of the materials, there was a note from somebody, maybe here at the university, that Ruther had urged you to go to Olivet. Is there any truth to that you remember?
I don't remember that,
No.
but it's entirely possible.
Mm-hmm. So you were there for those, what, about two years?
Well, I had mostly finished 3 years. It was a kind of program where it was so individualized that you kind of did all your required work at your own speed, and there were no A, B, C, D, E grades or anything like that. So it was a rating of superior, pass, unsatisfactory kind of thing, and lots of writing, lots of essay kinds of things, lots of research. And we did lots of independent study. which is part of the whole Oxford system.
And then you went back there after...
Yes, I went back and got my
after the war.
after the war, got my senior year done there.
Okay. And I can't remember if we had talked or not. I think we did, about how you came to work after Yale for the AFL Workers Education Bureau.
Oh.
Why that particular position?
Well, I was job hunting, and I was definitely interested in adult and labor, workers' education kinds of programs. I tried very hard to get on with the CIO education department with Kermit Eby, who was the head of it. But the opportunity opened at the Workers' Education Bureau, and I, of course, had, as I mentioned earlier, had friends in relatively high places in the education field. Florence Sweeney, and who was then the vice president of the International Union, and Arthur Elder, who was in the field. He ran the Workers' Education Bureau, Workers' Education Program in the whole state of Michigan. So those people, once the job was announced, were very helpful.
Who were the people that you worked under at the Bureau?
I was directly under we had a very small staff, but I was under a man by the name of John Connors.
Okay.
He was the director.
How many other folks were there in the Bureau?
We have maybe 4 or 5, mostly in the office kinds of things. I was the only field person, and it was interesting and challenging kind of thing to go out and simply try to set up seminars and conferences and training sessions. And as a matter of fact, there was enough demand so that I responded quite often to requests for help. Will you come to Colorado and help the state Fed set up a...
Just to make sure we got that complete sentence. So that was when you met your wife in St. Louis, that you were there to help.
I was in St. Louis to interview one of the graduates, because we inevitably you send a strange person in from outside. The existing staff in the union, some of them had problems, some of them had conflicts, things. And there's always the question of, well, is this some kind of special person? In a few cases, it was, is this a spy from the International Union? And so, we had to juggle these things around and do a lot of talking out with both the staff and the person in charge, the student, the graduate. So there was a considerable amount of field work that we did to deal with these problems.
What was the most interesting part of being with that institute?
I guess probably was just the challenge of setting it up to begin with, and the fact that it survived. Its form has changed. That was because of the fact that the ILG staff finally decided that they had to have a union, and the graduates of the institute were involved in that. But so the program changed somewhat. But I think the initial challenge of just setting it up and getting it to run. As I say, I started out arguing vigorously that it would never run, and it did.
Does ILG still have a similar kind of an institute program?
I'm not sure what the exact duration of the program and the yearly basis is, and how it's changed otherwise, but it's still in existence. Whether they still take 40 in, I'm not sure. I didn't realize this until later on that it essentially was fulfilling a need which the union had because they couldn't get sufficient staff to do the basic organizing. I don't know that there was any agenda or desire or any kind of felt need that these people would stay on indefinitely. I ended up feeling that our role was to provide the cannon fodder for what was necessary. And if a few people survived all that, fine. If not, I don't know that there's any conscious feeling on the part of Dubinsky or the other top leaders.
And then around 53, then you moved over again, but stayed in the ILG.
Yeah,
right?
well.
How did that happen?
I'd gotten divorced and married during in 52. And we lived in New York. Betty was a practicing attorney in St. Louis. We had lots of choices to make, decisions to make, whether she was going to try to pass the New York bar and stay in the field of law, and then we lived on 93rd Street in Manhattan in a 5th floor walk-up apartment. It was very romantic and very young and exciting, but not necessarily in terms of a long-range having family and that kind of thing. And then by this time, after 3 years, the excitement of of creating this monster had begun to dim a little bit. And I had moved out in the union around the country, began to know the areas, know the problems, know the leadership. And one day in talking to David Dubinsky, I expressed the fact that I'm young enough and interested enough in what's in building the union to, if you ever have a place that you can use me out in the field in a different capacity. I like to organize. I be active that way. So think about it. He said, "Well, would you go anywhere?" I said, "Yeah, I don't have any problems about it." And I'm not sure that New York is my final resting place. So about 2 or 3 months later, he asked me to come and see him and said, "I would like to assign you to the South. What do you think about that?" Because as it turned out, Dubinsky had New Yorkers' view of the world. Everything ends at the Hudson River, and so I'm not sure whether he knew all the ramifications of sending somebody out. But in any event, I thought he said, "Go talk to Louis Stolberg," who was then I don't think he was even the secretary, but he had a lot to say about the organizational work. And we talked, and I said, I'm a pretty good organizer. I was active for a while before I got married in organizing the very, very powerful tenants council out in Kew Gardens.
Kew Gardens, I read that.
Yeah. That was a pretty neat operation, and the only time I ever got onto the front page of the Daily News. We did a mother-baby blockade of Queens Boulevard, and for a traffic light, and the picture was showing these ladies and their babies being put in the back of the paddy wagon off to the jailhouse. And, you know, it was we had a very vigorous program. We you know, completely child daycare center and art classes and bowling league. And, you know, we had the whole newspaper. We had the whole thing. Big project, you know. I was thinking about this the other night. I think there were 64 buildings in that project. And
Is that still there?
probably, I don't know what it looks like now.
Right.
Probably not in very good repair. It was no good when we were there.
Were they co-ops or they were not?
Oh,
Were
just private rentals, yeah. They may have had to be torn down and replaced because they were built very badly. That was always one of the big issues was tenants repairs, you know, apartment repairs. But in any event, laying all this out for Stolper, he said, no, we don't have in mind you becoming an organizer. We want you to be the director of the Southern Departments. So that was a big shock, you know, because it was not. I wasn't even aware that they were. I knew the Southern Department was in bad shape, but I didn't know that was what they had in mind. In any event,
Who had been heading up Southern Department?
a man by the name of John Martin, and Martin was old, and sick, and nice fellow, but very. Martin had a point of view that if you had one member, you had one problem. If you had 5 members, you had 5 problems. And if you had 100 members, you had an awful lot of problems, you know. And that was his point of view. That's what he ended up with. I don't know what he was like when he was younger, but so that's there was no growth taking place, and they needed a non-Jewish white should be in the South.
Why did they feel they needed those particular?
Oh, because it's just a general point of view about where the South was, and I guess they were probably right. I don't know. You know, it's difficult to second guess them, but in any event, I was white enough and young enough to meet that basic qualification. So I came south in October of '53.
To Atlanta? Or?
No, our office was in Chattanooga at that time. Now, why Chattanooga? Because the few members we had in the South, one third of them was located in Chattanooga. The Signal Knitting Mills, knitted underwear plant. And the second part of it was over at Florence, Alabama, which is very close to Chattanooga. So 2/3 of the membership were located in those 2 places. Chattanooga was a very nice place to be in. We rented a log cabin up on top of Lookout Mountain, but it was a hellhole to try to work the whole South. I mean, because if you flew anywhere, you had to fly into Atlanta and connect with planes to Chattanooga, and I was forever missing my planes in Atlanta, and calling Betty and saying, hey, I'm in Atlanta, the last plane has already left, and then she'd have to turn around and go home and wait, until I could get the next plane. It was very inefficient. Yeah. And so after a year of that, I moved the office down to Atlanta.
Who else was on staff with you?
Oh, we had a fairly, let's see, probably about 10 or 12 staff people. I had considerable difficulty with the person who Martin wanted to succeed him. Her name was Jolie Walden, and she was a a big pain, and tried to sabotage everything. So, but that's, that was finally dealt with, and she then resigned and left, became a non-union contractor here in Atlanta. But the staff was, well, as a matter of fact, when I came on as director, Bonanno was an organizer for the region. He was one of the first graduates of this place. Matter of fact, might as well go on the record. I saved his first job because Martin wanted to fire him, and I put a stop to that. So
wanted to fire him because of some drive? Or
well, he thought that Bonanno was a New Yorker and didn't fit in.
That can be a terrible accusation in the South.
It is, yeah, right. Well, I had lots of problems with that too, but
sure.
but
less so.
At least
yes.
But Bonanno was a talk like a New Yorker.
Sure, right. I mean, culturally, his background is
right,
Italian American, New York,
right.
and all
At least I can say, well, I really came from Detroit, So, but that's part of history which Dick probably doesn't want to deal with. But, he got saved by the skin of his teeth. So, but I think he was the only one. Most of the others were local people out of the shops or from the labor movement here in the South.
Was ILG growing in the South at that time?
Well, we had, when I took over, we had 3,800 members in all 10 states. When I left 11 years later, we had 15,000 members. And I'll finally talk about that a little bit because that became part of the reasons there was conflict with the leadership and also why I decided to hang it up. But we did grow substantially.
Were those mostly runaway shops?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Almost without exception. These knitting plants had been there for a long time, but most of the shops that were moving in, it's quite different from today. Today, runaway employers, as a matter of fact, union employers don't come south. They go directly to Korea, into the Philippines.
Or South America, maybe.
Well, not so much. Some of them to South America, but mostly it's to the Far East.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, I think I'm still right on that. And, the Caribbean still is attracted to some because in the nature of the industry, these were mostly family-owned small operations. A few big corporate giants, but very few. And so, if you're going to have a plant somewhere, going to rural Mississippi ain't exactly the place you want to go. You go to Jamaica or to Puerto Rico or someplace where you get some sun and swim, or Miami.
Right.
That's
management can live in a little style there.
Right.
Too.
Well, in Miami, the pattern was very, very simple. The employer would be in New York, essentially, and open a little shop in Miami, and he would charge it off against his. He'd have a condo in Miami Beach, or he had a girlfriend, and he would make manager of the plant. And, there were all kinds of extra reasons. And in those days, if you went to an employer's club, the conversation would go something like this. Oh, wow, I've just opened a marvelous plant in South Carolina, modern, air-conditioned, cheap labor, great place to work. And the guy next to him at the bar or at the poker table would say, if that schmo can or get a plant like that, I'm going to have one too. And so there's a competition that took place, and that always led. So then the next year he'd say, not only do I have a plant in South Carolina, I got one in Mississippi, I got one in Puerto Rico, and so that was kind of competition went on all the time. There were parts of the industry which were always on the run. The best story to illustrate that was in South Carolina. We organized a plant that had run away from Fall River, Massachusetts. The plant, by the way, the ethnic part of it is very important. In South Carolina, it was all white. In Fall River, it was all Portuguese. But it ran away from Chicago to start with. The family's name was Sopkin, S-O-P-K-I-N. The grandfather, the man who set the company up, was in Chicago. The Chicago plant was all black. The difference was when the union organized the plant in Chicago, he ran to Fall River, non-union. When he was organized in Fall River, he ran to South Carolina, where we organized him. He then opened a plant, this is now the grandson, opened a plant in Florence, South Carolina, all black. We organized it. Lo and behold, after I left as regional director, they ran away again they became one of the plants along the border.
Maquiladoras.
Right. All Hispanic. Now it's a great grandson already who's running. And now that's a pretty dramatic example, but a similar pattern would take place. I told once I had an employer with 4 shops in Mississippi, made women's lingerie, movie star. I told him, I said, his name was Milton Herman, I said, if you could figure out a way, if there were a way to produce garments cheaper on the moon, you would do it. He never denied it. He was in the low end of the apparel industry. The pressure was constant to go for the cheap, and so that at that period of time, companies were running away to the south. They don't do that anymore. As I said earlier, they now go directly to the source.
And then further?
I guess they're bigger now in China because there are certain kinds of things which are very attractive in terms of, and since the computer age, a lot of the stuff that they did, they even now cut fabric by computer, and I don't know, probably a lot of it is being sewn by computer.
Yeah, so they need a less skilled workforce.
Well,
training
less skilled in terms of
handwork.
Handwork, yeah. The whole idea about doing stitching by hand, that's gone, and that's true both in the union sector and the non-union sector. It's a constant battle.
One of the stories I wanted to be sure to ask you about was in reading some of the background materials, I realized that in 1954, was a case that came out of Baxter, Georgia,
Oh, yeah.
about the license
Yeah.
fees that people,
Yeah,
for,
right,
for
right.
whoever reads this for posterity, a lot of cities used to charge these,
Oh,
these
yes.
fees for
Still
organizing.
some, but they don't really.
What do you remember of that story?
Oh, very interesting story. We were interested in what was being produced in a nearby town of Baxley called Hazelhurst. I think the company's name was Hazelhurst Manufacturing Company. I sent two female organizers in there to check it out. Now, Hazelhurst was very definitely hostile to unions, and when two strange women show up in town, these were not young types who were out hustling or anything. They had to be up to no good. Well, the first thing you do, of course, would be listening on the phone at the hotel and find out what they were doing.
Right, because those are the days when the operator could listen in on your calls.
Oh yeah, sure.
Everything went through the switchboard.
Sure. I advised them to stay in a nearby town, just so they wouldn't be harassed and cops wouldn't be following them around and all that. And so they decided to stay in a little place called Baxley. None of them had ever heard of it before, nor had I. And they were arrested and told, you've got to pay, you're out soliciting for the union, you got to pay this fee. Well, it's so outrageous,
Did they call you right away, or what?
Oh yeah, sure. It was always, that was always the case when the staff would get into difficulty. They would call me.
Do you remember, what do you remember getting that call?
Oh, it was sometime during the night, They tended to pick people up at night. Somehow, after dark was more scary, And so, we paid the fine and they left town. I've forgotten now what the fine was. It wasn't a great deal of money. And promptly filed suit challenging this outrageous arrangement. Well, that case went through the Georgia Supreme Court, which found in favor of the town.
They did.
Oh yeah, well the Georgia Supreme Court has gotten into the 20th century just lately, just barely.
I wonder who wrote that. Do you remember?
No, I don't. They were such a bad bunch of people.
And before that, it had to go through the county level as well.
Oh yeah, we went through all
a
of
treat.
Well, we hired to represent us a great lawyer here. He's now retired. By the name of Ed Pierce. Ed Pierce was then part of a firm here that did labor week work by the name of Poole, Pierce and Hall. They finally got out of the labor business. They represented the Teamsters, among others. They represented us. But Ed Pierce was a great lawyer. But he told us the sad truth, which was that we got to go through all the state courts first before we can go federal with the thing. And that took some time. Must have been a couple of years, I guess, before we got it up to the Supreme Court. And we finally won that case. And it's still the case which, if a town tries to pass one of these foolish ordinances, they're reminded that the city of Baxley versus Staub, Rose Staub was her name, S-T-A-U-B.
I think the other it says here too is Mamie Merritt. That strikes
Oh
the
yeah, right. She's just an organizer.
Did they go back during the 2 years? Did
No,
anybody
no,
go
we-
back to Baxley? You just left it be?
We left it be. We were that was simply a place to stay.
Right, that's true. Hazelhurst was the focus.
And
Did Hazelhurst get organized?
no,
Never did.
I don't even know if they have a plant there anymore. They've probably moved on to making fruitcake or something. But it might still be there. But the it became it's a good case, good precedent, because it does head off a hell of a lot of trouble and harassment.
It became famous. There was a couple of others, in fact, that I wanted to ask you about that were sometime during those years. I'm not sure exactly when. There was a famous situation that developed at Bruton Fashions, Brewton, about women wearing buttons, union buttons, and I think that eventually went to the Supreme Court as well. But in that, where did it come about? I'm trying to remember the town.
Where's Bruton?
I could look it up before we finish here today, but I wondered if that struck a bell. They were forced to take off ILG buttons, and that went up. We have some of the file in the back, so we can look at that and maybe then get back to it.
Sure. I'm kind of vague on it. Bruton Fashions.
Then the other, though, that was many years later was Anita Knitting Mills near Spartanburg.
Oh yeah.
That was a bitter.
No, Oneida is near it's in Andrews and near Charleston.
Oh, okay. That was a bitter strike, right?
Yeah, and very well. We probably ought to get into the whole question of strikes and Southern strategy, international strategy. We were encouraged to strike. I mean, there's no. If I said to Dubinsky, "Hey, we got to pull this shop out. We got to have to do something," always encouraged to, go ahead, strike them. I don't recall in 11 years any period of time when we didn't have a strike going on somewhere, and we spent lots of money on strike benefits. Not, by today's standards, nothing, but $20, $25, $30 a week strike benefits was standard, and strikes were very common. And if we had to strike them, we struck them. Now, it is only toward the end of my time with the ILG that it began to dawn on me that there was, why were we striking? I finally described it to myself and to anyone who asked. I was the bush beater in the tiger hunt, and that the more I made trouble in the South, the less likely it was that the New York employers and New York-based employers I knew this was going to happen.
Okay, so you were talking about the plant in Greer.
The plant in Greer. I'm blocking now on the name of the plant, but they made children's lingerie, and they're organized in New Jersey, and they're supposed to. One of those contracts that said you can only work in union shops. We went up there. The workforce was, the members in New Jersey were all black, and they crossed our picket line up there. And I was at the meeting in which the business agent stood up and told them that these people from the South were white and that they wanted to work down there and put the fear of God into the New Jersey workers.
Didn't help at all, I'm sure.
No. Well, I took that up with Dubinsky and said, what am I supposed to do here? You've got a union shop up in New Jersey, which is refusing to honor a legitimate strike that you proved in South Carolina. Well, that he didn't get fired, but he was shoved out of there somewhere. I don't know where he went. And it was outrageous. That's all you can say about it. So, anyway, Marshall is right. I'm not sure about the dates any longer, but I think I gave him the story. So
Probably so.
Yeah.
So that's how that one went.
But Marshall doesn't take notes. It's all in his head. I mean, fantastic photographic memory, and so he puts it all back, and he may have gotten a thing or two rearranged. But
In strikes like in Fayetteville or similar, another role I'm interested in is the clergy. Do they have any much of a role, positive or negative?
For the most part, in these small towns, either they're neutral or they're negative. Occasionally, we get. As a matter of fact, in many places in the South where we called upon them for help, the Catholic clergy were very good. When we finally settled the plant that Jonathan Logan had bought, became known as Joe Log, for J-O-L-O-G. The local manager said the workers don't want to get in here. It was the same guy that had been in Fayetteville. Harry Farber was his name. Harry Farber, the rascal, convinced the New Yorkers that the workers in Joe Log would never join the union. So we arranged with the people in New York, with Hochberg and the big shots, that we would organize the plant and use just informal check-off if the workers. We get an independent person in to check the
Just have a
names.
card showing.
Card check. If we could do that, it was ours, right? They agreed to. I can say figures, what the hell, Well, sooner or later they're going to give us enough trouble but we asked the local priest to come in and do the check. He did. If I thought hard enough, I could probably even remember his name. But they were, clergy in that sense were helpful. In most places, I think probably you'd have to say that they were not for us, unless they were one of the charismatic churches or one of the people where our members would be big in that. Sometimes the Church of God local pastor would be helpful, but by and large they were not. Rabbis, only in places like Atlanta did we ever get any kind of help. Larger communities. Other than that, there's not much there. Let's see. We were talking about the IUD campaign in Spartanburg. The results were fantastic, as these things go in the South, and it was. I believe that the stirring the pot in one community with 8, 10 different unions involved was very helpful. That was on Nick Zonerich, who was then the national organizing director, was the guy officially in charge of that campaign. When he left it, Harold McIver became the head man, and while Harold dispersed the forces somewhat so that you had a statewide joint campaign. And I think it's been helpful, but not nearly so much, in my judgment, so much as that one community joint kind of thing. as a byproduct, well, I started to tell you that Hochberg came to me wanting a shipping center for southern goods. And I said, well, you know, Spartanburg is on 85 on the way to New York. And I had this other agenda, you see, about putting the concentration in one place. And they commenced to build a shipping center. Before they completed the shipping center, he came to me one day and said, hey, you know, we got a new thing we're doing, and we got a building already constructed here. Instead of a shipping center, we're going to put a new kind of product plant in Spartanburg. What is it? It's the double knit fabric. And so we gave them the green light on that. Fascinating thing about the double knit was they started out with raw wool, spun it into thread, and knitted it, and then sewed it and shipped it out of there. That became a fantastic thing for not a very long period of time. Started out wool, then about a year later they went to polyesters and other kinds of fabric. But we finally organized it. Big struggle. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But at one point, while this whole process was going on, you see the big bundles of raw wool coming in off the trucks. I said, you know, where's all this stuff coming from? He said, oh, we have a little bit of sheep ranch in Ireland. And I said, okay, Irving, I'm sending an organizer over there. We're going to organize from the cradle to the grave. You know, we're going to get that. Oh no, don't do that. So, in any event, finally, what we came to was this: they had a local lawyer. They had a real estate business and all this stuff. His name was Bean, B-E-A-N. I'm not sure. I've forgotten what his first name was. But a thorough scoundrel, rascal, if there ever was one. And Bain was nothing but trouble for us in trying to organize the workers in this new plant. Hochberg called me once when we were really, it was getting very nasty because they were just refusing to talk about union in that plant. And I said, okay, what's going on now? He said, well, I got to see you privately, outside, and away from Spartanburg. We got to meet somewhere. And we met here in Atlanta. He said, Bean has told me that if I sign a union contract in that kind of Spartan County, that they're going to arrest me and put me in the chain gang. He said, now I'm too old. I can't go through all that. And I said, boy, what a fool you are. Don't you know that the chain gang in South Carolina has been abolished for 20 years? He ain't going to put you in any chain gang, you know. He's just trying to scare. Really? He said, is that true? I said, well, check it out with somebody else. Don't believe me. Check it out. Sure enough. So he relaxed at that point. And as a matter of fact, I think shortly after that, they got rid of Bean. And he was simply representing the other companies in the Chamber of Commerce, you know. And anyway, we went on to organize that plant. We ended up in Spartanburg with 2,200 members in that whole operation, including the Teamsters, the truckers. As a matter of fact, at one point I tried to I said, I don't want the truckers. They don't represent garment workers. And a whole set of different problems there. They really belong with the Teamsters. He said, please don't give them. He said,
don't call them in here.
We will do whatever you want with the Teamsters, with the truckers, but please don't go there.
So they didn't go Teamsters?
No, they stayed with us. They did very well in our contract. So anyway, we ended up with a major local situation here.
Sounds like it's
All
a
flowing out of the Tennessee strike all the stuff that happened thereafter. It was, when the old man, Schwartz is his name, Irving Schwartz. When he retired, his son took the business, and it began to slide after that, and they finally sold it. I don't know who bought it, but I think one of the international conglomerate kinds of things bought it.
What local was that?
I don't remember the name. 5E. We had so many locals. Each one of these plants.
Usually one plant was a local.
Yeah, and we had a business agent there. I think he's dead now, or he else is very ill. Joe Ferguson. I hired Joe Ferguson. He had been with the furniture work and lost a bitter strike in Florence, South Carolina. And I met him in Columbia one day. Joe was a young guy, very attractive, very nice guy. And he said, I really need to work. He said, I've got a family, I got to have a job. I said, okay, on one condition, that you will go where I want you to go. I'll go anywhere. I need a job. I said, well, what I want you to do is to move your family to Greenville and become a part of the community in Greenville. Because we need to crack that SOB there somehow. It just bothers me that we can't get a toehold in Greenville.
Especially being so close to Spartanburg, it's so wrong.
Well, and I said, you may work around there, but your home will be in Greenville. And he did. He became the business agent for that local. He did a fantastic job. It was just great. So that was one of the more interesting developments in that whole thing, especially since how it started, and how it led up to this.
Do you want to take, maybe it's a good place to break, and then when we meet again, we can continue talking about some of those same years, and especially the civil rights years. We're getting into that there.
Oh, yeah. And also, we had the whole development of the mobile health center.
That's right, that started about then.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was I think that was an important development.
Yeah.
Saves a lot of women.
Well, we need another good chunk of time now. We can do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Without the cake and without the machine problem.
Right.
This is a continuation of the interview of Al Kehrer, taking place now on Sunday, February 26th, at his home in Austell, Georgia. Okay, we had last been starting to talk a little bit about Greenville. You had mentioned Joe Ferguson and how you talked to him about moving there and how he eventually became a business agent.
Yeah, well, Joe was a young, very hungry former business agent for the furniture workers, and had lost a very bad strike in Florence, South Carolina, and I met him in the aftermath of that, and offered him a job with one condition, and I could tell him where he was going to live and be stationed. I had always been very fascinated by the Greenville, Spartanburg area, because it was so industrialized with apparel and textile mills, but we had had no success in organizing anything there. So I had the idea that if we planted a staff person in the community, and he put his roots down there, his kids went to school there, and all of it, we might be able to get some kind of hold on the situation. Our typical organizing experience was that there'd be a plant that you were interested in trying to organize, and you would ship people in from Timbuktu, and it took them a long time to get acquainted with where the roads were and where the people lived and what the local politics were. So my theory was that with someone like Joe, we could begin to make a difference. And I don't know whether you could actually measure the difference, but I think there was a difference.
Where was Joe from originally?
I think he was from Virginia. And so when we began to be successful in Spartanburg and organized a local there, Joe became the business agent and was an excellent business agent, very, very well thought of by the members, and I think from that standpoint it was a big success. There may be more organization today in Greenville. Spartanburg was still pretty well organized, and with the BMW auto plant moving in there, I think there'd be a lot of background, a lot of people hired who've got union experience and appreciation, and the UIW shouldn't have too much difficulty organizing.
How did he try to make whatever inroads he did in Greenville? Do you remember?
Oh well, in general, what he did was just in terms of organizing.
Right.
Oh well, the interesting thing is that most of the companies who were there and the companies who came in there already were well briefed and well organized themselves as to how to deal with the union if it came in. And there was, and I suspect probably still is, a blacklist in operation, so that it was a question of if people did join the union and it was known, became known, they and their whole families were put on the blacklist. So it was pretty hard nut. When the textile workers finally got to J.P. Stevens, and I was at the board meeting, the J.P. Stevens board meeting one year, and the town's fathers were pretty outraged at the fact that union people were actually walking the streets, and, as a matter of fact, when we had the campaign against what was the name of the man who was nominated for the Supreme Court?
Against Borg?
Haynes.
Oh, okay.
I did a lot of work for the AFL-CIO in trying to find out things about Hainsworth. The only attorney who would be hired by anyone was in Greenville. Hainsworth lived in Greenville, an outside suburb of Greenville, and this particular man, I'm blocking on his name, but it may come to me, was the president of the local bar association. And I talked to him at length, and he told me a little bit about Hainsworth that was useful. He then went up to testify in Washington on Hainsworth's behalf and reported to the Senate, I guess it was, that there was this agent from the AFL-CIO. Now this is a union, this is a man who earned money from representing unions. And, that was already, he was not prepared to go that far, to deny that the AFL-CIO was involved in any way. But that was kind of the atmosphere, and it still exists today, although the companies and the nature of the business has changed substantially. Spartanburg, on the other hand, we had a big presence finally in the town, politically as well as the general business atmosphere. There's nothing like representing people who are earning pretty good money to or relatively good money to make a difference.
What was the breakdown in a place like Spartanburg or in Greenville? Was it easier or harder to organize white and black workers?
Until the Civil Rights Act, until the Title VII, most of these plants were overwhelmingly white. And you had black workers, mostly female, working in this so-called dirty jobs, the hot and sticky jobs, pressing and that kind of thing. And black males would be almost exclusively in the shipping department. One never had difficulty getting them involved. It always was. I don't remember any situation in which the black workers were anti-union and negative. And of course, one of the company tactics, almost universally, was to take advantage of the fact that their members or their workers were white and white females, and if the union came around, the first thing that went out was, "Oh, you join that union, it's going to be taken over by blacks," and that was a fairly successful tactic. I had one occasion which was a company where we were having difficulty and probably going to have to strike, get a new contract, and the first thing that the company did was to see that the KKK newspaper, called the Crusader,
I think so.
showed up, mailed to the homes of all the members, and it was we were able to counter it because we told our people what was going to happen. But it was a picture. It was an issue of the paper in which the front page, big picture of Jim Kehrer, who was then Secretary Treasurer of the IUE. He was shown dancing with a black female. They don't say that the black female was the wife of an African diplomat at a state function in Washington, but it was that kind of thing which was very common through all that entire period.
When you held meetings, you held them integrated?
Oh yes.
Whoever would come?
Oh yeah. I was very tough on that, and sometimes, well, in Atlanta, for example, we had one of the oldest locals in the ILG. It's still around, but very small. And before I came, they had it was one local, but it had a separate section for black members. They had, as a matter of fact, they met separately and they had their own officers. And I had a tough time with them because I insisted that happened, And she ended up as a pretty good friend of mine, but the president of the black section was a woman by the name of Bessie Wynn, and Bessie was very, very upset by the fact of the integration. But that was because, not so much race, but because she felt her own power was being diminished.
Did Miss Wynn become an officer of the local? Or?
Yeah, well, she joined with, I insisted that she be on the executive board. She was, I don't think she ever held a president or secretary treasurer, but she was on the executive board. So you had those things happening, but and even in all her, I mean, she wrote to President Dubinsky about what terrible things they were doing, you know. But aside from all that, she never did say she was going to get out. I mean, she wouldn't leave. And so, you know, it was, and that was throughout the entire South, whether it was Mississippi or North Carolina, black potential members and black members were very loyal, they stuck with it.
Where would you have meetings when you would have meetings?
Well, it was difficult. We in the earlier days, we had situations in which we would have a regional conferences. I think they still have them, a week-long educational conference. And if you went to any ordinary Southern hotel, it was difficult to get entrance. You know, on some occasions, most offices of hotels simply turn their backs on the whole thing. But I recall once in New Orleans, we had to go out and hire a hall, you know, for our exclusive use because the hotels were too difficult to deal with. So the meetings, you know, we always had to search, and never, well, sometimes we used churches, but mostly it was, we'd hire a space somewhere.
Let's talk about that issue too, because since we're talking about, maybe we can back up a little to the earlier 50s. Before we put the tape on, you mentioned that 54, of course, was an important year in terms of the Brown decision. And you were with the ILG for 1 year before that. But during that whole period, how did the civil rights issues develop within the union as far as your work?
Well, aside from the fact that the employers would play on black and white issues, the general atmosphere in the community, in the schools, in the churches, and in politics was pretty red hot, and our members reflected in their communities, the cross section of local opinion. It reflected itself politically, because even if we would say we endorse somebody against what's the old man's name in South Carolina, now running the Defense Department,
Thurman or
we endorsed his opponent. The union did. My members in South Carolina didn't vote with us. I mean, they liked him. He was militant and anti-black. Well, in 1956, I guess it was, the International had its convention, and its triennial convention in Atlantic City.
Let me turn the tape over a second. Okay, you were saying the actual record of Klansmen was different.
The actual record of the Klan and its various branches was just the opposite. If there was a strike, or if there was an organizing campaign, you could almost guarantee automatically that they were going to be opposed to the union and opposed to the strike. And we had over the years innumerable strikes. It was the Klan's people and not necessarily just card carriers, but people who had the Confederate flag on the front of the pickup truck and the shotgun on the back window. They were inevitably on the side of the employer. And we had numerous run-ins with them. I remember working with a group of black union people in Natchez, Mississippi. And they called me to come in and meet with them. I met with them. These are the plant in which they worked was majority black. They met with me in the dark of night in a secret place in Natchez. What was their latest complaint? The complaint was that the president of the union had marched in the Klan parade on Saturday, recent Saturday. And what could we do about that, you know? Well, I said, you know, it seemed to me one obvious thing, if you represent the majority of the members, to vote them out of office would be the first thing to do. You know, you could do other things, but that seemed to be a very practical approach, is to exercise your right. They finally did, but it was several years before they got it all together. But the Klan was very prevalent, and more so than with my members and potential members, because the citizens councils were the big shots, the middle class, the upper middle class types, whereas the Klan happened to be more worker, blue collar types. I was, from time to time, when my name was in the paper or I got active in a particular campaign, we were subjected to harassment calls, that kind of thing, threats, and that became kind of routine. You know, never really got too excited about it. But
You didn't take any steps to protect yourself?
well, at one point we were getting harassment calls at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and that became kind of annoying more than anything else. And Betty would get them while I was away, saying, well, "We hope you kiss your husband goodbye in the morning, this morning, because he's not going to get back across the river tonight," that kind of thing. And so we finally, we made all the usual calls, called the FBI, the telephone company, and whatnot. And the telephone company finally agreed to put the monitor thing on. I guess I don't know what they do these days. Probably could do it a lot easier, but they put a box on which recorded all the incoming calls, and when that happened, the calls eased off some. I have a feeling that the network out there said, "Hey, they got a monitor on their telephone. We better quit some of these threats."
Where was it? What cities or states was it the worst in, you think?
Well, probably overall. Well, northern Louisiana was bad. Still is bad. Mississippi was pretty bad, although that's not true so much anymore. Mississippi was probably, in gross terms, was the worst. Although you could move out of downtown Atlanta, Georgia wasn't exactly what you call modern.
Right. Not an open-minded area. Was it more intimidating because there were mostly women who were your members, you think, if Klan had some presence and they knew about it?
I think just the opposite. Yeah. The one thing about women workers is once they got religion, they were hard to stop and tough. You know. In many of these communities, the women were the chief breadwinner. They brought home the money. Now, their husbands may have had technically a job as a farmer, or as a forester or something, but it was the women who were actually provided the cash. And so, as they got into it, it became more in public work, as we used to call it. They would begin to manage things, and if they decided if they could fight the boss, they can fight the client, or fight their husbands, or whoever. It was, I think it's pretty descriptive for. No, you know, there were obviously exceptions, but no, I don't think the Klan really had any kind of real, I don't recall any real impact on them. If they were out on strike and fighting the whole community, the Klan was just one little other annoyance, you know.
How about the politicians in the various areas where you had ILG locals? Were there any that were helpful on any of these civil rights issues?
Or any issues.
Or any issues, any of the labor issues for that matter.
Yeah. By and large, no, I don't recall. Now we had managers of plants or New York owners. They would talk to you privately, you know, and give you encouragement, but not very much help. The president of the company in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was one of a rare exception. Reed Murphy was his name, and he was quite outspoken, liberal Democrat, believed in higher minimum wages. You know, what he said essentially was, look, if I raise wages in my plant, I'm fighting all this cheap competition out here. Now, if I raise the wages, if you raise it everywhere, we've got a level playing field. And he was kind of an exception. But by and large, the employers and the employers generally, and particularly the manufacturers we dealt with were, you know, and these. You have to understand that in those days, I don't know how it is now, but in those days, bringing a New York or Chicago or Cleveland metropolitan northern employer into one of these plants in one of these communities was a great culture shock for them, and also they brought with them their attitudes about workers and politics, and their involvement in the community in which they had their plant was, most of them, first of all, didn't own the plants, didn't build their own plants. Most of them leased the equipment, were tax-free, and they were absolved from local taxes. I may have mentioned earlier this company in Mississippi that which the employer quite candidly, as a matter of fact, he was proud of the fact that all he owned was the keys to the front door. And he didn't have any investment in that community. The town had built the plant. The town had leased the machines for him. He was in seventh heaven, you know. Anyway, so that they tended not to get involved in politics. They would go to the country club and play golf with the big shots in town, banker, etc. And that was about the extent of it. I think I told you earlier this whole story about my friend Irving Hochberg being told he would end up in a chain gang and believing it, you know. Very, very naive and unaware of what's going on around him. So, yeah, you know, if you were in New York and having dinner somewhere, they might make some comments saying, "Boy, you have a tough job. Good luck," you know, that kind of thing. But so far as doing anything about it, no, they didn't.
Getting back to the civil rights issues again, too. What was your involvement or the unions in those years in the late 50s, leading up to King becoming active and more demonstrations being held?
Well, we of course were, as I indicated earlier, we were very supportive in terms of assisting where we thought we could do our best work, and that was to do practical things like printing and use of facilities, and we had, you know, like in Spartanburg, we ended up with a pretty good union hall, which became used by civil rights organizations, and wherever we had which were quite numerous, requests for involvement, support, help, either turning out people or supplying, making contributions, that kind of thing. We did it routinely, yeah, you know, the ILG was one of the unions who the word got out that we would help, and we did a lot of that kind of thing. And you know, now when they write about all that was happening, they think that there was some grand scheme operating. It really didn't work that. It wasn't happening that way. I mean, it happened from day to day and from issue to issue, and you know, you would come to the next problem as it took place. There was no, you know, I'm always amused at how well thought out it was. Now looking back,
A master plan.
there was a master plan. There wasn't a master plan. You just grabbed hold.
Do you remember the lunch counter sit-ins?
Oh yeah. I'm not sure, recall what involvement we had particularly. I'm confident we did because my man in North Carolina was very active. That was, again, you see, what you operated at several levels. I mean, in terms of support, in terms of participation, in terms of solicitation of support from other unions, you know, and so it was a whole kind of very loose networking taking place. I never was personally involved in the lunch counter thing. Not in North Carolina. I was in Atlanta.
What year?
It was when the Lebs sit-ins took place. You weren't around when Lebs was. That was the only place to eat delicatessen kind of kosher food.
Oh.
But that was a pretty good place to eat, matter of fact.
Is that where they took place?
Yeah.
Sit-ins? Where was that?
That's at the corner of Lucky and Forsyth Street. There's a drugstore there now. Right across the street from the Equitable Building.
Right. About how many people were involved?
Oh. They sat in there and over 2 or 3 days. Seems to me there must have been 10 or 12 sitters in.
Who was organizing that one?
That was a SNCC operation.
Who were the SNCC people involved? Do you remember the leaders?
Well, Lewis was involved. Julian Vaughn was involved. Julian and I have laughed about that since that time. But you know, there again, it's strange how one thinks that lunch counter sit-ins were invented in the late 50s and 60s. I've sat in a lunch counter in the University of Chicago with Bayard Rustin over the same issue in 1939. You know?
Wow.
I mean, it was. He sounds familiar. In those days, the hostility in Chicago was just as severe as it was in.
How did you come to be in Chicago with them?
Oh, I was attending some radical meeting.
What? Go ahead.
Well, it was over Christmas holidays in between semesters. So, you know, I guess when it was all happening here, it didn't seem to be, first of all, you didn't know you were making history.
Right. You never do when you're making it.
Well, and so, you know, it never really kept that much detailed account of precisely what was going on. But,
And again, do you remember any adverse reactions from locals about any of that participation?
no, as I said earlier, first of all, if you're a garment worker and you're working all day, you got 2 or 3 kids at home, and you got a husband to contend with, and all, you don't really sit around and actively think about, hey, what's going on out there? Why are they doing this? And, as a matter of fact, there used to be the labor director for the NAACP. I'm blocking on his name. In any event, he was a very pessimistic type, a white guy. And I rode with the plane with him one night from Atlanta to New York, and he was trying to get me to prove that his pessimism was maybe he was righter today. I thought he was. Today he tend to be pessimistic, but you know how terrible things were. And rather than doing that, I would give him positive examples of what I considered to be progress. And he ended up thoroughly disliking me because I was so bubbly and buoyant, you know, in the face of all these terrible things. And I guess that's also how you survive. Survive through a lot of this stuff is simply by not being horribly depressed. But our typical member had her hands full of her own personal concerns and did not really was not very much involved or even think about it. Somebody out there is doing something, but they don't know much about it.
Were there other what other unions were supporting the civil rights movement those years?
Well, the auto workers, steel workers, almost without exception during this earlier period, the building trades were on the other side. We changed a lot of that as time went on, but there are two groups who are really cannon fodder for the plan and that whole operation. That was the building trades and the paper workers. And places like North Louisiana, the foot soldiers for the Klan were in fact the paper workers. More than now, Amalgamated was good.
When you say the amalgamated, you mean?
Amalgamated clothing workers. There were not very many. And, Act Two today is great, but in the earlier days, their structure was such, and the industry was such, the membership was such, without any good progressive leadership guiding things, they couldn't count on them for much. There were exceptions. In Mississippi, the amalgamated clothing workers was very good. The Secretary of Treasurer of the State Fed was amalgamated. There were probably, if I went down to the list, probably 10 or 12 unions who took not only good positions, but actually did things.
Mm-hmm. Then, in terms of the civil rights movement, I suppose some of the next, 1960 brought some changes in terms of the pace, leading up, I guess, to 63, to the march. What events do you remember?
Well, you see, there again, the National March got a lot of folks involved because it was really a union kind of thing, Even though people at the King Center are trying to rewrite the history to make it seem like it was King's idea. In fact, it wasn't. He was a speaker at the march. At the end of it, Randolph and Rustin were the people that did it, and the ILG was a heavy participant, mostly from the Northeast. We had some buses from here, but it was mostly from that where our biggest membership were, where they had money,
Were the buses from here made up of
actives,
staff and activists?
Yeah, right. Mostly local officers and we did our little piece.
What states did they come from?
Mostly because of logistics. It was hard to bring in someone from Mississippi.
Expensive. From
Georgia east up to the Carolinas, Tennessee, western Tennessee. And we had 2 or 3 buses, I think, 3 maybe. And the period of time had so many buses going everywhere, we knew the costs down to the last little bit.
You know how many fit on the bus and exactly where to stop.
Yeah,
and how long
right.
it
Yeah,
takes.
exactly. Yeah. We stopped as few places as we could, by the way.
It's a long trip, so it only
Yeah.
makes it longer if you stop.
Yeah.
What other unions sent folks from the South that you remember?
The ones I've mentioned:
Mm-hmm.
auto, steel, rubber. I think it's safe to say that they were largely the unions who were from the CIO type unions, more accustomed and more interested and more involved over time in these issues.
What was your impression of the march?
Oh, it was uplifting, to say the least. I mean, it was amazing. We've had probably bigger crowds since that time, but the whole spirit and enthusiasm and it was in the atmosphere. You could feel it, you know, and it was a very, very exciting, rewarding thing. It's never been really duplicated since that time in terms of the spirit.
Did all the ILG people go together, march together?
Yeah, well, you kind of grouped with your people. You know, they tried to organize it by identifiable groups. So if you were a red button, you know where to go to the red button place, you know, that kind of thing. It's more sophisticated these days, but and part of the excitement was in just the big mass milling around. You know, people have remarked since that time about how there were no problems. You know, that's true. I mean, people had their focus on the issues of that time, and the speeches were all great. You know, I mean, it helped the spirit of the occasion. Yeah, it's. I don't know that we'll ever accomplish that again. Well, we'll maybe get forced to it, but we're rapidly. As a matter of fact, I talked to Washington the other day, and they said, well, some good is coming out of all this stuff. Some of the people who have been talking to each other in the women's movement are back talking to each other. And the environmentalists are now talking to the labor people, and you know, so if you get enough of that negative pressure, you accomplish it.
What do you remember?
You can cut all that out.
That's all right. No, it's, the interviewer tends to agree, for the record. But which speeches do you remember being most impressed with at the time at that march? I'm sure there were many.
Oh yeah. Well, of course, you know, King was a great speech. I particularly liked John Lewis's speech. Randolph himself was first rate. There were so many. Those three were real standouts. Lewis, because he was a young radical, you know, and they tried to cool him down a little bit. He didn't cool very well.
What did you think coming back? What was your impression? What was going to happen next?
Oh, again, you know, one just knew that there was going to be something going on, but the agenda was not all that clear, and the objectives were not clearly stated. You know, we just knew that we were going to do something, and I think that's what most people ended up thinking. You know, we've made this statement, and now let's see what we can do. Because there was still this tremendous, between the atmosphere and all the spirit in Washington, there's still a big gap between what was actually going on in the local communities. And so we didn't come back with any list of, well, other than the fact that you knew you were going to keep the pressure on for the vote, for public accommodations, 4 jobs, you know, that kind
Do you remember doing any formal report backs to locals when you came back?
no. I don't think it was,
Formal.
well, it wasn't. The attendance and all was not universal, so and are the locals in the region, unless I happen to be speaking at a local